So hello and welcome to the ACRL Science and Technology section sponsored webinar, Equity Starts Before Hire, a look at equitable approaches to hiring and retention. I'm Chapel Cowden, my pronouns are she and her, and I'm joined in moderating this session by my colleague, Laura Palumbo, and we are members of the ACRL Science and Technology section's Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion Task Force. We are honored to have with us two distinguished guest speakers. Tarita Anantashai is currently the interim head of the Department of Learning and Academic Engagement at the Syracuse University Libraries. Her professional and research interests include diversity, equity and inclusion, early career development and mentoring, and outreach programming. Tarita was an ALA Emerging Leader, is an alumna of the Minnesota Institute for Early Career Librarians, and is currently a fellow in the ARL Leadership and Career Development Program. Tarita received her MS in Library and Information Science from the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Twana Hodge is currently the Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Librarian at the University of Florida Libraries. Her professional and research interests include diversity, equity, inclusion, accessibility efforts in the LIS curriculum and the workplace, library residencies and fellowships, cultural humility and librarianship, and the retention of underrepresented and BIPOC library staff and librarianship. Twana is a 2013 Spectrum Scholar and was an ALA Emerging Leader. Twana received her master's in Library and Information Science from the University of Washington. The format of our program consists of a 45-minute presentation followed by a brief Q&A. All participants are muted and will remain so. Please use the chat feature and we will do our best to collect your questions along the way. The presentation portion of our event will be recorded and all those who registered for the event will receive the recording. Now, without further ado, welcome our speakers.
Thank you, and good afternoon and good morning, depending where you are right now. Twana and I are so pleased and excited to be able to speak with you all today. First of all, many thanks to Laura, Chapel, the ACRL Science and Technology Section EDI Task Force, and ACRL and the ACRL Equity, Diversity, Inclusion Committee for inviting us and for all of your support. Thanks to all of you as well. We see some old faces, our old friends, and new ones, hopefully, for taking the time to be here and engaging with you in this discussion. And so with that, Twana.
All right, so just want to acknowledge that February is Black History Month. And acknowledging those who were forcibly taken and enslaved in what we call the United States of America, and that Black history does not start with slavery, and that Black history is 365 days a year. In celebrating Blackness and working to eradicate anti-Blackness that exists everywhere. And so I would like to take a moment of silence to acknowledge those who have lost their lives due to structural and systemic racism and oppression, as well as those who have lost their lives to COVID-19. Thank you. Next slide. All right, so we had some wonderful introductions, and so I don't feel any need to add much to it, just to say that if you hear a little bit of an accent, is because I was born and raised on the island of St. Thomas, which is in the United States Virgin Islands, which is close to Puerto Rico. And so I will let Tarita introduce herself.
Yeah, like Twana, we had some wonderful introductions earlier, and the only thing that I'll add is that Syracuse University Libraries, which is where I'm located right now, is sitting on the Onondaga Nation of the Haudenosaunee, also known as Syracuse, New York. It may or may not look similar to Hoth, as we have in the background here today. So you all probably saw the description, but basically our objectives here today are to cover the importance of equitable hiring practices, which are crucial in laying the foundation for equitable retention practices as well. So we'll discuss and also invite all of you to share your own strategies, approaches, or even barriers for equitable hiring and retention, including different ways we can take risks, experiments, assessing, that sort of thing as well.
So I want to take this time to go over the Brave Space agreements created by Mackenzie Mack, inspired by Mickey Scott Bay Jones, so that we agree to struggle against racism, sexism, transphobia, classism, sexism, ableism, and the way we internalize myths and misinformation about our own identities and the identities of other people. We know that no space can be completely safe, and we agree to work together towards harm reduction, centering those most affected by injustice in the room, even if that means centering ourselves. We agree to sit with the discomfort that comes with having conversations about race, gender, identity, the nonprofit industrial complex, etc. We agree to try our best not to shame ourselves for the vulnerability that these kind of conversations require. We agree to value the viewpoints of other people that do not challenge or conflict with our right to exist or challenge or conflict with another's right to exist. We agree that it's okay to have feelings. It is okay to feel uncomfortable when we're discussing complex topics about boundaries, accountability, personal relationships, organizational relationships, justice, and care. And so if you agree to these Brave Space agreements and you have access to the chat box, please type I agree. So that means you are agreeing to adhere to these Brave Space agreements for this presentation here today. All right. And so as I see people very quickly adding I agree. Next slide, please.
Awesome. And so we are going to be applying the tenets of progressive stacking in this webinar. So according to this technique, which intends to give underrepresented voices a chance to speak, if you self-identify as belonging to an underrepresented group, especially Black, Indigenous, and people of color or BIPOC, then please include an asterisk at the start of your question or comment, and we'll prioritize them immediately. Tawana and I are going to be going back and forth a lot, so we'll try to keep an eye on the chat, but Laura and Chapel have graciously agreed to also help us collect them in the end if we're not able to keep up with it during this screen share. So similarly, recognizing that some questions may also be very personal to you, if you'd like to submit a question anonymously, please use the private chat feature to Lauren or Chapel or to either of us. Hopefully we'll be able to see it and reach out to us, and we'll be happy to read yours out loud anonymously on your behalf. Right.
And so with that, we're going to dive into recruitment. But some things before Rita takes it away is that equity starts before hire. It's not just about diversity or just being inclusive, but really think about equity and what barriers and opportunities that exist to it. Thinking about professionalism, behaviors, mannerisms that have been weaponized and based and centered in whiteness, thinking about the isms and phobias, so racism, classism, sizeism, transphobia, Islamophobia that exists, thinking about psychological safety and empowerment, but also considering the different factors. So like your geographic location, city, rural, suburban, the county, state, regional, and national influences and political affiliations. In regards to if you're located in the Pacific Northwest versus the Deep South versus Midwest, and thinking about history, intergenerational trauma, segregation, internment camps, and more, and thinking about the impact that current things that has happened, COVID-19, the deaths of Breonna Taylor and George Floyd, that sparked the fact that racism still exists, particularly anti-Black racism. And then thinking about the language that we utilize. And so I'll let Tarita take it away.
All right. Thanks, Tawana. So before you even start thinking about the hiring process, assuming you want to diversify your staff, I think it's really important to first ask yourself if you're truly ready and prepared to do so. So really critically reflect on your own workplace and conduct your own self-assessment first or foremost. So in other words, hiring 1 or 2 BIPOC workers, for example, starting a diversity residency program, what have you, is not going to solve your diversity problem, quote unquote. And if you want to successfully bring in and maintain BIPOC or other historically underrepresented folks in your library, you want to make sure that you have an organization that is, and if you want to, have an organization that is truly inclusive and equitable, you have to recognize that it means that the structure and culture of your library has to also fundamentally change, right? So bringing in a BIPOC library worker into your space without first building your cultural competency, your cultural humility, will be bringing them into, whether you recognize it or not, or whether you would even describe it as such, a potentially hostile environment. And that hostility can manifest in a lot of different ways, right? So take a good hard look at your organization and realize where you are and where you aren't, what your organizational climate and culture is, what the organizational competency of your leadership is, the department and the folks. Oh, I hear somebody on the line. I think if somebody has their microphone on, we might want to mute that, but I'll continue anyway. But again, what your climate and culture is, what's the cultural competency is of your leadership, of the department and the folks with whom they'll be reporting, and across your entire organization. So, and if saying that you have a diversity committee is a start, but again, that is still just an isolated group and doesn't reflect the cultural preparedness of your entire organization and the individuals in it to truly support these workers. So also ask yourself, what are your institutional and organizational values and goals that hopefully go beyond just representation, right? So this isn't just about numbers, although, that's important too. It's not just saying we're going to have X number of BIPOC library workers and call it a day. So ask yourself, what is it that you really want your library to look like? What is it that you're trying to accomplish? If you want it to be diverse, why? Like, honestly, why? And, is it just so you can have Black and brown faces on the website, or because, again, you want to fundamentally change the structure and culture of your library and to have your assumptions, your ways of doing things challenged and shifted, right? So this relates to the third bullet point, which is what work have you already been doing, or have you? And part of this is determined also in that self-assessment mentioned earlier. So what are the actual equity issues that already exist within your libraries? Is it that you don't have representation? Is it that the representation that you have is not at the librarian or administrative level, i.e. those that might have influence and power? You need to really be able to identify, what your actual equity issues are in order to be able to then identify the solutions, right? You might be hosting a variety of trainings, but are you, number one, doing anything about them? And are they actually addressing the work that you need to be doing specific to your institution? So relatedly, what are the existing barriers to not just recruiting, but cultivating and maintaining successful library workers? And what culturally validating spaces and opportunities are available within your library, within your institution, within your local community. And when we say this phrase, culturally validating spaces, do you even know what those are, right? Tawana will touch on this a little bit more later, but what support systems and tangible investments are you already providing specific to your underrepresented library workers? And the final point here is also consider the concept of vocational awe as coined by Fobazi Itar and how that manifests as well. So for those of you that may not be aware, it's the concept that libraries are inherently good and beyond critique. And so that can manifest in a lot of different ways. So, we're providing excellent service for our patrons. We go above and beyond for them, but without also simultaneously reflecting on what might be asked of your library workers in the process and what they are or aren't able to critique as an equity issue, for instance. And Katrina Davis Kendrick's research on deauthentication is another thing to consider. So considering not if, but how your library workers may be making decisions daily on what aspects of their identity they may be hiding or reducing in order to avoid shaming, microaggressions, and that sort of thing as well in your environment. So hopefully after you've kind of started to do that work, you need to also think about where equity exists in that sort of pre-posting stage, right? So in creating the job ad, for instance. So some questions to ask yourself are, who is writing this job description? What are the real requirements of the position, that minimum versus preferred? And what is it that you are providing upfront? Salaries, position context and the role within the organization, life beyond the job itself? And what coded, gendered, or ableist language might also be appearing in your ad, right? and recognize that the more requirements you have and the way that you word something could and very much does result in a number of folks self-eliminating themselves out of the process. And ask yourself also, how much are you asking up front in addition to a CV? Extra letters of support, statements 1 through 3. The job ad itself, in other words, could very much be its own barrier and equity issue. And so then informing the search committee, some things to sort of consider are who's the lead, and how is it that they're dictating the flow and the priorities of the search, and how is it that you're also preparing your search committee, right? So a search committee requires certain skills. And have you provided any sort of training for those sorts of things, like how we're able to identify bias, how to create appropriate rubrics, how to truly understand how to make this an inclusive process. So as an example, at our library, we've advocated for our own diversity and inclusion team to actually meet with search committees at the launch, to advise them on certain recommendations and the rationale behind it so they sort of understand that. So, as an example, like providing questions ahead of time and how that can allow for a richer and more inclusive experience. Considerations for how you should schedule and structure an interview day. And really quickly, I will mention that this doesn't mean just find a BIPOC library worker at your library all the time just to serve on that committee. There are a lot of unequal service and tokenization implications behind that. I myself have recalled that in the first 5 years at my institution, I served on 8 search committees, whereas others had served on 0 in that same amount of time. And so structuring the interview process. So what is it that you will provide to candidates throughout the process, right? So what barriers can you identify and eliminate? I'll say it again, provide the salary, provide questions ahead of time, or at the very least topics or examples you're eager to hear them speak on. And proactively ask them throughout the process, things like food preferences, if walking tours or other sort of mobility types of activities are part of the day. Or what else it is that you can do to make their visit go smoothly, rather than putting the onus on them for having to ask it. Again, being very careful not asking illegal questions like, do you have a physical disability, right? And think about who is it that they will be meeting throughout the process, and perhaps even allow them the opportunity to provide input on who they would like to meet, right? And finally, just also consider legal concerns, right? So what are the federal, state, and institutional laws and policies and other sorts of cultural norms that you need to be aware of? Or, are you scheduling certain interview days during cultural holidays, for instance? So just some other things that you need to be aware of so that you are providing a fair and equitable process throughout. So this is an example of a paragraph that was included in the DEI librarian position at the University of Florida. Hello, Twana. And that's that, oops, sorry, let me go back. We want to emphasize that the preferred qualifications are not required, and we are committed to helping our future colleague develop these preferred skills. We strongly encourage those who are passionate about fostering diverse, inclusive, and equitable libraries to apply. So there are similar statements out there, and certainly we've drawn inspiration from this and others as well, that even specifically mention, we acknowledge that women and BIPOC historically tend not to apply for positions if they don't feel they meet all the requirements, but we highly encourage you to apply. We're committed to supporting our future colleague, et cetera, et cetera. So once you're into the actual recruitment phase, that also needs to be a very proactive process. So thinking of new ways of doing things and just not relying on how it's always been done, or how it's always been done. Because being passive and doing things the same old way will probably give you the same old results as well, right? So listservs, job boards, online communities such as social media groups, we all use these to some degree, but also expand on where you're posting, right? So where is it that you're typically posting and where are you not? And that's also an opportunity for you to personalize things. I know personally we run into issues with our big HR in terms of what additional language or paragraphs we can include in the ad that they post. But your email postings are a really good opportunity for you to more individually say something more than just, hi, we're recruiting, copy paste job description here, right? And also think about, are the places that you're typically posting, do they tend to have membership fees? Do they have to be a member? of ACRL, for instance, subscription requirements or other sorts of barriers. So in other words, are they only reaching those who have the financial means and the connections to actually be able to view it? Again, more equity issues and barriers. We put an asterisk next to this fourth point. I think I'm counting that right. In terms of using personal networks. And we do this because it may be really tempting to turn to, your BIPOC library worker or friend and ask them, hey, can you post this to the ethnic caucuses or to We Here or something like that. And while it's really great to reach these networks, if you're not already, be really sensitive to the extra labor that you're essentially asking of your BIPOC workers in doing so, and recognize that there may be those that are uncomfortable with being asked to essentially vouch for a particular position, particularly if your institution hasn't addressed the, are you ready yet issues noted earlier. So direct recruitment is another opportunity. This could range from anything like personally inviting potential candidates to apply, or even, asking them to have a conversation. I'd love to have a phone call with you about a potential opportunity that we have here. Soliciting nominations or recommendations as well. I've heard of some search committees who have been specifically tasked with identifying and specifically reaching out to X number of potential candidates. And, when they become a thing again at physical conferences, conference booths, individual meetups, Q&A sessions, scouting, and meeting with people of interest. Though I do believe I've seen examples of this being done virtually through virtual career fairs and other sort of virtual Q&A sessions as well. So again, think about who is it that you're reaching, who is it that you're not, and how is it that you're reaching them? Because again, if you're doing the same things that you're doing before, you're probably going to get the same result as before. So the next part is then sort of ensuring that your entire interview and offer process is also inclusive and equitable. So I believe I saw Sojourna in here. So a shout out to Sojourna Cunningham, challenging the notion of fit. And so Sojourna, Samantha Gus, and Jennifer Stout did an excellent paper, which we have linked in our resources at the end, on issues with thinking about if someone fits into your institution and what you were essentially saying in terms of your organizational culture and the dominant culture being maintained as a result, right? So again, you really need to look at your workplace culture and, not just blame it on, well, they're just not going to fit here, or they won't succeed here, or, they weren't good enough to succeed here, because what you're actually saying is reflective more of the organizational culture. The other thing is counter reimbursement culture. So this is a huge barrier for a lot of folks, asking them to fund their travel, their lodging, everything for the entire process, to save their receipts and submit forms and then wait for a check to come months later. There are quite honestly people who cannot afford to go through this, this whole process. And then consider the negotiation process, right? I feel like this topic often comes up in terms of what candidates should consider, but the same goes for search committees and HR. So are you offering an equitable salary that matches other similar ranks, that represents the actual duties being asked of this person? And earlier we also mentioned, what is it that you are providing to candidates throughout? How committed and invested are you in finding and offering options to them before they even have to ask for it? So saying up front, we'll provide you X budget for whatever equipment, technology, et cetera, that you may need when you get started here. And then assess the overall search, get feedback on from your candidates, and seek feedback on that whole process, on what worked, what didn't, and then adjust for next time. But also ask what barriers and issues you're identifying at each stage of the process that you hadn't anticipated. If you're noticing that you're not garnering the types of applicants you want, then what are you going to do to resolve that right away? So then ask yourself, what is it that we will define as a successful search? This is a particularly powerful example, but I know of at least one dean, not in libraries, although perhaps there are examples of that as well, who had emphasized that BIPOC representation was important for this search. And when they had seen who the final candidates were and went through the whole process, actually told the search committee, we're starting over. And I get it, starting over, having to redo a search, that's a really expensive process, right? But if your values and goals are to have an inclusive search and you're instead, racing to rush through a process just to fill a vacancy, you may very likely be introducing a lot of equity issues throughout, because spoiler alert, a sense of urgency is one of the characteristics of white supremacy culture. And if that is your ultimate goal, we just need to fill this spot really quickly, then fine. But you also then have to own up to the fact that you've clearly indicated what your actual goals and your values are in doing so. And so this is by no means an exhaustive list of HR considerations and recruitment strategies. And really, we can't provide you a whole checklist of all the things you must do for your search. But we'd offer for all of you right now to just sort of think back on some of the searches you've been involved in on either side of the table, and perhaps one you have coming up, and reflect on it. And we invite you to enter into the chat, what are some other barriers or opportunities in recruitment, and what recruitment strategies have you implemented at your institutions? So I'll pause right now and see what folks would love to offer to your fellow colleagues into the chat here.
So Tarita, I've been monitoring the chat and just capturing comments as they come through. And so people have agreed that a good fit is often weaponized against BIPOC library workers. And, people are happy that you're talking about the reimbursement culture, which can be a barrier for people who might want to do so, but it might take, several weeks to months, and some people may not be able to afford that. And even if you do have, like, say, a credit card, that's some interest fees that you're not getting reimbursed for and things of that nature. And so there's a lot of things that is coming through in the chat right now, but I will continue with the things that 100 plus in a profession with 87% of the librarians identify white, who are more likely to have access to generational wealth than BIPOC. Additional funding, direct payments, not reimbursement, should be required to make it equitable. And the concept of being the only one, either the only person of color, the one African-American, Latinx, et cetera. And in an effort to create diverse organizations, libraries hire only one of each ethnic group. So, the fact that they have, a range of skin tones in the room, and it's like, yes, our job is done. That some organization might think that just having a person of color in the room or someone from an underrepresented group means that their job is done.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Tawana. And oh my goodness, I can't even keep up with this chat right now. So I'm glad that you have been able to see it. And I hope that I can get a chance to sort of go through all of this as well. And so we invite you to consider, to continue adding in some other sort of impressions, ideas, or things that you have done at your institution as well. But at this point, I will hand it off to Tawana to talk about equity and retention.
All right, thank you so much, Tarita, for talking about recruitment. And so your job is not all over once you get them in the door, them, us, really thinking about your organizational culture, thinking about the supervisory style. Does this person have to manage up? Navigating pay and benefits. Usually there's a 30-day to maybe 90-day period where you have to decide, which health insurance, dental, things of that nature. I'm thinking about right now, we're still in the middle of the pandemic, and considering kind of like your institution's response to the pandemic, and how people who may be looking at your institution, how that's influenced, because there are some institutions who vocational all was just very, very highlighted. And so I'm thinking about, how are you going to be supporting the folks as they come through the door, if they're going to be working virtually or on site? Thinking about the power dynamics, that was something that came out through the chat box. So power dynamics in terms of, formal position, supervisor, supervisee, but also thinking about the identities that we hold that are formal, thinking about the identities that we hold, but also thinking about the informal positions of power that we have. People bring their experiences with them, traumatic, great, not so great experiences. And taking into consideration that we're not intentionally minimizing and dismissing people's identities, experiences, and more. And also the fact that libraries are a reflection of the society that we live in, okay? Libraries were segregated. We have the NALCO, the National Association of Librarians of Color, ALA, Reforma, Bacala, and Apala that still exists, and there's still a need for them even in 2001. sorry, 2001, 2021, I'm going back in the past when we actually didn't need masks anymore. And think about like, we've made some progress, but there's still a lot to go. Thinking about low morale and what contributes to that, abuse, neglect, dysfunction. If you had to describe your organizational culture to someone else, what words would you use to describe it? Thinking about like, is there a culture of retaliation or retribution? And thinking about how we think about civility, this culture of niceness and avoiding conflict, and the othering and isolation that might exist in your place. So next slide, please. So when we think about onboarding and orientation, it is not something that can be done in 2 weeks, or maybe even a month. One of the things that I talked to a lot of people about, particularly when it came to residencies and fellowships, was the fact that is the position, is the department and unit, the branch division, library, if it has multiple libraries, university, and the culture and librarianship, particularly if they are early career, or this might be their first library job, period. There's a lot of things that you have to orient the person to about the processes and how to navigate workflows and the norms. That is a part of there. And so and a potential idea is having an onboarding buddy that's not their supervisor, and thinking about the people who are typically involved: supervisor, human resources, co-workers, mentors. Next slide, please. And I'm thinking about support systems. Mentoring is such a key and critical thing, particularly peer mentoring. There is a lot about mentoring in general, and there's a good bit of literature about mentoring in libraries, but taking into consideration about peer mentoring, is there a formal mentoring process that everyone in the libraries have access to, whether they might be tenure track or not, if they're staff? What are we doing when we think about culturally, as Tarita mentioned earlier, culturally validating spaces and opportunities? Are there ways that you are able to find folks who are related to either your identities or experiences that you can connect with? When I used to interview, I would ask, are there Caribbean restaurants in the area? And if they're unable to answer the question, a little red light goes on in my mind, and then even if there's no one, even and thinking about the fact that there was this experience where the search committee, they had a prospective candidate ask them, what was it like for a single Black female to live in Gainesville, Florida? And no one on the search committee could answer the question. It got routed up to the chief diversity officer, and really thinking about like what certain questions that people may have. Not engaging in the authentication. People want to be able to bring their authentic self to work, but it's hard to do that if you don't see yourself represented. But even if you try to do so, people don't acknowledge it or celebrate it. Thinking about the people mentioning tokenization before, thinking about the access to benefits, those without benefits, and access to benefits, and being able to get the help and accommodations they need without shame or stigmatization that currently exists, and thinking about affinity groups, professional development support, and growth opportunities. Next slide, please. And so, are your policies and procedures for evaluation, service, advancement, workload recognition equitable? Could they be considered inclusive? Do they aid in retention? So a lot of us, so most of us might be working from home, but there are some libraries who are fully open, that are partially open. How is that impacting how people perceive their environment? Do they feel safe? Do they feel that their well-being is at the forefront? Are we so focused on being servants to our patron that we have neglected to serve ourselves or to center ourselves? Getting rid of the hustle and grind capitalistic mentality that exists. I'm thinking about service. There was something on Twitter about asking people like to list to say how many service or committees that you're on. Some people range from 0 to 21, and that is unrealistic to have 21 service commitments, whether that's internally or internally to the library that you're working at the institution, in the profession. because work will always be there. You won't. So please don't grind yourself into dust. Being able to say no and having the support system to say no is critical as well. And so having your supervisor, your manager support and backing is key to this. And also getting rid of perfectionist tendencies and mindsets. This is something that I'm currently working on as well. And thinking about who you're asking to do the work and how it impacts them. Okay. Thinking about the expectation for service and workload. And also taking into consideration work-life separation. Other duties assigned. We've seen this all over the place of in terms of essentially, you're willing to do anything, and that if you are newer to the profession, or maybe you're in a staff position, that you get to do a lot of things that other people don't want to do. Does your institution have a retention policy? How does your institution define retention? What supports are there and what is missing? Next slide, please. Okay. Retention is we, not just me. There's a focus on, if somebody leaves the profession, it's because, they made that choice and it had nothing to do with their environment, with their colleagues, with their interaction with their supervisors. And the key is that retention is the individual, but it's also the institution that they're employed in. It's also the associations and library association and organizations as well. We all play a part in retaining people, and that it's a never-ending process as we think about this. Okay. A key part of equitable hiring, recruitment, and retention is knowing what is right for your search. Library or institution. It is not a one size fits all. I will repeat it again. It is not a one size fits all. Equality is not equity. Okay. Equality can ensure that the status quo remains the status quo. And thinking about how we might be silent, these absences, and how that can, and to some people, most folks, equal complicity. Thinking about our colleagues, supervisors, mentors, and more, and their roles in making sure that from the recruitment through the onboarding and orientation, through how we navigate through advancement and promotion. Thinking about our roles and responsibilities. Who is being silenced? Who is not being heard? Who's being erased? What oppressive systems are we intentionally, unintentionally upholding and perpetuating? And these are questions that I reflect on with myself and others. How do we make sure that we're not scapegoating or putting the sole responsibility on BIPOC, on underrepresented groups? Awareness, education, and action. It's not about saying the right thing. It's not just about saying the right thing. Because I think a lot of people get caught up in not wanting to seem fill in the blank. It's also about doing the right thing. So what are some successful retention strategies that you all have employed? Where do you all need to go from there? The time for unintentionally opting out is over. As someone once said, brilliantly said, the applications for allies are closed. We need co-conspirators. We need accomplices, and we need people who is going to help, and we need liberators. This is a lifelong work. Are you ready? I would hope the answer is yes, because you can never truly be ready for anything. But the real question is, are you committed? So let's hear from you all. What are some other barriers, opportunities in retention? What retention strategies have you implemented at your institutions? And so, if we can't see a problem, we can't fix a problem, by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. And so we're going to go into the Q&A portion of this. I think the portion that most people are interested in. But here as our resources, some recordings that we highly suggest that you watch. Particularly, Why Did I Leave the Profession? That happened last year. There's Why Did I Leave the Profession 2 that's coming up. That's next week. And these are some upcoming webinars and courses that continues the conversation. And I hope you will have the opportunity to attend them. And then this is our contact information to continue the conversation if we don't get to everyone's questions here today. So thank you all.
So I haven't taken a look at the Google Doc to see if folks have added things in there. Let me see. Thank you all. Yes, I think, whoa, as things get copied into there. Let's see. Yeah, so at this point, you know what, I will stop sharing my screen shortly so we can all sort of see each other. But we invite you all, if you have any sort of questions, again, this is a reminder that we're using progressive stacking as well. So if you have a question or comment and you do identify as BIPOC or from an underrepresented group, to please put an asterisk next to it. And so let me, oops, as I closed too many windows here. And the other portion that I think we may have neglected to mention earlier is that the Q&A portion we are not going to be recording, or it will be edited out. And so if that allows folks to be able to more freely ask questions as well. And so, Twana, have you seen some of the ones that are coming up? I'm going to look for the questions on the Google Doc in the meantime.
This is Gina with ACRL. I'm just confirming that I'm stopping your recording right now. So enjoy the Q&A, everyone.
Thank you, Gina.